Jen Zaborsky from UW-Herbarium. And anyways, you can take it away. So thank you.
So I'm going to talk about the three largest families of plants in the state, the asters, sedges, and grasses, kind of building on what I talked about in the first talk, which was basic plant morphology and then some of the more common plant families. But I've saved these three for a separate talk because they're the largest families in the state and some of the largest in the world. And they also have really complicated morphology that is unlike what you see in a normal, typical plant. So the Asteraceae, or the aster family, is the second largest family of angiosperms on the planet, only slightly smaller than the orchid family, with over 23,000 species worldwide. Extremely diverse morphologically.
I'm sorry, could you remind us what angiosperms are?
Flowering plants.
Flowering plants.
Yeah. All the species in Wisconsin are herbaceous plants, so annuals or perennials, but around the world there are shrubs, trees, herbaceous vines, woody vines, aquatic plants, really, really tiny little desert annuals that are just a few millimeters tall, and even succulent plants that look like cacti. And then all of them are brought together by one character, and that's this really unique inflorescence, which is called a capitulum, or a head. And it can be really, really tiny, like this little one, or it can be really big, bigger than this woman's head. Despite it being such a large family, it has very little economic importance. So for crops, it's just like sunflower, endive, radicchio, lettuces, artichokes, some other herbs, and then lots and lots of weeds as well. So the head or capitulum of an aster, which looks like a single flower, is actually lots and lots of small individual flowers that come together in a special inflorescence or structure that bears the flowers. And that's where the name compositae comes from as well. It's another name for this family, meaning composite, referring to that cluster. So in these heads, you've got a bunch of little things called phyllaries, which are these special bracts that surround the individual flowers. So these are just modified leaves. And when you're talking about all of them together, you call them an involucre. This structure is really important in telling apart a lot of the different members of the family. And then they surround all those individual flowers, which look like petals here, and then which here look like little stamens. So I know this is a big wall of text, but to explain this, so in Wisconsin, again, these are just annuals or perennials. Some of them have latex. So you think of lettuce, chicory, dandelions, when you break the leaves, they have white or colored sap. Mm-hmm. Their leaves can be simple or compound, which I talked about in the last class. So they can have leaves that just have a single blade of tissue, or they can have multiple blades of tissue, very finely divided, like in yarrow. And they can be alternately arranged on the stem, so back and forth. They can be opposite, so one across from the other, or whorled, where there's three or more leaves at a node. But all of them have that very special head, where the individual flowers are arranged to look like one giant flower. And then all of those little individual flowers are borne on a big flat or sometimes cone-shaped structure called a receptacle. And then around that receptacle, you have all those phyllaries, those little bracts kind of enclosing it, like you would think of like the green parts, the sepals on a bud of a rose opening up. That's kind of what the phyllaries are like. In Wisconsin, there's only 3 different types of these heads. So across the world, there's a bunch of different types, but in Wisconsin, we've only got 3. Disc flowers or disc heads, radiate heads, and ligulate heads. And then, so this is an individual flower from a sunflower. And here you can see the ovary, so the female part of the flower that produces seed. These little kind of like nail-looking things, that's the calyx. So I talked about in the last one, the little green things that enclose a flower and bud. And then the flower parts, the petals, is this tube right here. So they have 5 petals that are fused into a little tube like that. And you can see the tips right there. And then there's a bunch of little stamens coming out, and then 2 stigmas. So the female part of the flower that's receptive to the pollen, and they come like pushing out of it like that. And then these little, what are sepals are called a pappus in this family. And they can be little awns or scales or bristles, or they turn into fluff like on a dandelion or lettuce. They've got a bunch of different adaptations for dispersal. So then there's a diagrammatic drawing. So the ovary, pappus, the corolla or the petals, the stamens, and then the branches of the stigma. So there's a lot of different flower types of those in florets, as we call them. So really small flowers are called florets. In Wisconsin, we've only got 3 types. So the disc floret, like I just showed you, true ray, which is reduced to just 3 petals. You can see the 3 notches, and the other 2 are missing. They've been lost. And then a ligulate floret, which have 5 individual petals, but they're born in like a fan opened up rather than around each other, like on a disc floret. So disc florets are actinomorphic, which I talked about last time, means that they have radial symmetry. You can cut them in any plane and make a mirror image. Ray florets are just 3 fused petals. You can see the tips right there. And then the other 2 have been lost. And then in a ligulate floret, those 5 petals are fused and flattened out like that. And then there's none at the base, like in a dandelion. So these florets can come together in heads, and the 3 different types of heads with the 3 different types of flowers that we have in Wisconsin are the radiate heads. So these are the ones that you probably think of when you think of an aster or a sunflower, where you have disc florets, in the center. So the center part of this has the disc florets. And then on the outside are the ray florets, looking like the petals of that flower. And those are usually just female, whereas the disc florets in the center are male and female. Then you have a discoid head, which only has disc flowers. So like blazing star or thistles would be a good example of that. And there's no radiate or ray florets. And then a ligulate head, which only has ligulate florets. So they've got those 5 separate tips to each of the flowers. And then all the members that have those heads all have milky white or yellow sap. So I'll go over some of these groups and some of the more common members and how to tell some of them apart. So the family is broken up into tribes, which are just another lower classification level. And then within those tribes, there's a bunch of different genera and then lots of different species. In the chicory or like 2C tribe, these are the ones that have ligulate heads. So they've only got those florets that have 5 petals that kind of come out like a fan, and all of them have milky latex. So this includes dandelions, which have that pappus modified into a little fluff to carry the seeds. And I saw one flowering on campus on the south side of a building a couple days ago. So dandelions have already started, and then soon they'll look like that. Chicory is a member of this tribe. This is an introduced plant from Europe that's really common along roadsides. And then the root is used to flavor coffee, and it's used in granola bars to keep them together as well. The hawkweeds, so Hyeraceum. We have some native prairie and woodland species, and then a bunch of introduced ones from Europe. That orange one is really common up north if you drive along the highways, like in Rhinelander area. There's just tons and tons of it. The members of this genus are apomictic, which means that an individual flower will pollinate itself and then create seed that is just a clone of the parent plant. And so then you end up getting plants that look identical to one another, but different enough from other members of the same species that some people think that they should be called separate species. And so that's resulted in over 17,000 Hyeraceum names published by botanists over the last couple hundred years. Yeah.
Are these all based on appearance or genetics?
Both. Originally it was appearance, right? And then we thought that certain things were related to one another. And then genetics, in a lot of cases, showed that that was correct. And then in some cases, it showed that it was wrong. Yeah.
Okay.
Lettuces, the true lettuces, are in this tribe. So we do have some native ones like this tall blue lettuce, which is upwards of 10 feet. It can get really, really big. And then we have the one on the right is prickly lettuce, which is a roadside weed introduced from Europe.
Are those really tall ones? Those are native?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got a bunch of those right here. For electricity.
The sow thistles, these have little yellow dandelion-looking flowers, and they have prickly stems, but the prickles are really soft, and the plants themselves are almost like succulent and juicy, but they've got a lot of milky sap, and that's like a prime habitat is along a building or some other chunky area. The goat's beards, these look like giant dandelions, and they get like a huge dandelion-looking fruiting head later in the year along roadsides. These are also introduced. And then the Cinerea or the Cardui, these only have discoid heads. And then they often have filaries, so those little bracts that are spiny. So like in burdock, the little hooks, or in thistles as well. And a lot of members of this tribe also have prickly stems and leaves like thistles do. So burdock, introduced from Europe, there's 3 species. This is the most common one that a lot of people think is rhubarb when they see it when it's sterile, but it's definitely not.
It's not.
Yeah. The plumeless thistles, Carduus. The one on the left, Carduus acanthoides. I think that one's just called plumeless thistle. That one's really increasing quite a bit in Dane County. Both of them are introduced. And the nodding thistle, which is much taller with a much bigger head, is also introduced, and it's more common on highways and roadsides. But these are really, really prickly. You can see that there's just tons of spiny leaf tissue just up and down the stems. They're really nasty to pull out. And then the knapweeds, none of which are native to North America. So spotted knapweed is a really bad invasive species that this picture is really showing up, but just fills like sandy areas in the central part of the state and the western part. It's pretty common in Dane County too, but it invades prairies and savannas, unfortunately. And then, of course, the true thistles, so Cirsium. So we do have native and non-native thistles in the state. The native thistles tend to be associated with higher quality habitats, so like undegraded prairies. There's one species that grows in nice swamps and wetlands, and then we have a very rare one that grows just on the beaches of Lake Michigan. So the 2 most common non-native ones that you'll encounter are the bull thistle on the left with the huge, really spiny filaries and big heads, and then the Canada thistle with the smaller heads that spreads really aggressively underground.
Those are the ones that the roots start down and then they go out?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And then our native ones, this is one of our prairie thistles with the white undersides to the leaves. And then this is the dune thistle, which just grows along the shore of Lake Michigan in Wisconsin, Michigan. I think it's probably extirpated from Indiana and also Illinois. And then I think it's in Ontario as well. But you can see healthy populations of this in Door County, like at Whitefish Dune State Park. This tribe is the Anthemidae. So in this tribe, the leaves are usually finely dissected, so very ferny look to them. The ray florets are always yellow or white, and they're aromatic, but not usually in like a good way. They have a very like stinky smell. So if you have daisies in your yard and you've ever broken apart the leaves or even smelled the flowers, like they don't smell good, but they don't really smell really bad. They just have a weird type odor to them, but all members of this tribe have that. So daisies, this is a common roadside weed introduced from Europe. Pansy is a pretty aggressive weed also introduced from Europe with bright yellow heads, really late in the season, can bloom until we get a hard frost that finally kills it off. This is probably growing on your street in the sidewalk cracks. Pineapple weed, which smells kind of like pineapple. It has really tiny little heads, very, very small flowers. You can see in the ridges of my finger compared to the size of those little individual flowers in that head. Yarrow, which is a common garden plant, but is also, there's strains of it that are native to Wisconsin. And then the Artemisias, sagebrush out west, and then our native and introduced wormwoods. So this is Artemisia campestris, a dry prairie species that's pretty common in the state. This is an introduced one, an annual one from out west. And this is a European one, the common mugwort, which has become really common along highways and is spreading pretty far north. The Nephalii, this tribe is pretty small in Wisconsin. The filaries are very papery, so they look kind of like the straw flowers that you might buy from a garden center. And then they always have discoid heads. So our two most common ones are the pussy toes, which bloom really early in the spring. They've got little low leaves to the ground, and then these little like cat's paw looking heads to them. And then the pearly everlasting, Anaphylis, which is a pretty species of drier woodlands and prairies. The Eupatorii, these all have opposite or whorled leaves, discoid heads, and the flowers are never yellow. So they're pink, white, purple, there's blue ones, but not yellow ones in this particular tribe. This includes white snakeroot, which is such a common plant in the Madison area. It is native, but it's super weedy, and it loves disturbed forests, which we have a lot of in Madison. And then the Joe Pye weeds are also in this tribe. So there's some wetland ones and some upland ones as well. Bone set is in this tribe right here. And then the blazing stars. So there's a lot of nice prairie blazing stars, some really big inflorescences, and then others with smaller ones, depending on the prairie.
Are some of those introduced around here? Or
no, all of our liaches are native.
Okay.
The Senecionii is a pretty small tribe. They all have alternate leaves. And then the involucre is uniseriate, which means that each of the filaries, you can see, just line up one next to the other. They're not overlapping like a lot of the other ones were. When I showed that close-up of the sunflower head, you could see that all the little bracts are overlapping one another. And this includes this common landscaping weed, Grunzel, introduced from Europe with really small heads. I've seen this flowering in like late November, and then it can bloom again in February. As long as it doesn't get totally covered in snow, it can still hang on. And then the Pachyras, ragworts. These are prairie plants, pretty short, but they can invade lawns. I've got a patch that is just growing in my lawn. I don't know where it came from, but I'll leave it because it's nice. And then this also includes fireweed or burnweed, which is another really common weedy native plant. This is all over Dane County as well, in any kind of disturbed woodlands. It's got kind of dirty white disc florets, and then these big kind of deeply toothed leaves.
How big are the flowers?
The individual flowers are really
Well,
tiny. The heads are probably like
yeah.
that big, probably that big around.
Pretty big.
And then the Indian plantains or onoglosums, prairie plants. We've got 3 species in the state. This is the most common one. This tribe is pretty big, Helianthii. So these have receptacles. So if you were to take all the individual flowers off of the receptacle, there's all these little chaffy scales that are left, and that's distinctive for this particular tribe. Usually the anthers are darkened, so the part of the stamen that produces the pollen. And then the achenes, which are the fruit type, so think of a sunflower seed essentially, are flattened in this family, and a lot of them they'll be rounder. And then the pappus, so that would be a fluff and a dandelion, are little awns, so little points or just little scales on the edge of the fruit. And then this tribe is almost entirely found in the New World, not a lot of species in the Old World. And this includes the true sunflowers, so Helianthus, which we've got a lot of species in the state. Some of them are very difficult to tell apart. Of prairies, one species grows in wetlands, and then a bunch of woodland ones that look really similar to one another. So this is the sawtooth sunflower, just an enormous patch of it out at a prairie near Avoca, state natural area that's on the Wisconsin River. It also includes cup plant, compass plant, prairie dock, so other very common prairie plants that are often grown even in landscaping just because they're so big and they look very unusual with really big leaves in the prairie dock. Coneflowers, so purple coneflower, echinacea, yellow coneflower, Vertibida. black-eyed Susans and brown-eyed Susans.
Aren't there varieties of the purple coneflower though? So there's some that are
Yeah, so
native that are paler.
right. So this is our native one, Echinacea pallida, the pale purple one, and the purple one, Echinacea purpurea, is native to North America but not to Wisconsin.
Okay. And the yellow ones, those are all native?
Yeah, this one is native to
Okay.
Wisconsin. And then despite all of those ones looking very similar, this tribe also includes some that have very small heads, like ragweed, which is native, but is annoying because it causes hay fever. And cocklebur. So if you go to the shores of lakes and rivers, you often find this. The flowering heads are pretty small. You don't usually see them, but you'll find the fruits because they stick to your clothes and they're really hard and difficult to remove. So we've got one species of cocklebur and 3 species of ragweed in the state. Common ragweed is obviously very common. Giant ragweed is also pretty common around farms and down by rivers and streams. And then there's a prairie species as well, which is not as common, but all 3 of them are native.
The tall ones, that horse weed, or is there something?
That's in a different tribe. I will show
Different
that.
one.
Yeah. In this tribe, Coreopsidae, the outer filaries are differentiated from the inner ones in color and shape. I think I've got a good picture. There we go. So you can see that there's like 2 distinct types of filaries. So you've got like this group down here, and then you've got this other group a little ways up from them that actually like change from yellow to green in a way. So you don't see that in other tribes. And this includes the beggar's ticks, bidens, some of which have just discoid heads, and then there's others that have radiate heads. These are the ones that produce the little flattened fruits with the 2 prongs that get stuck in your clothes later in the year when you go through a wetland. And then Coreopsis. So there's a lot of garden species of this, but we have a couple native ones as well. And then the Asterii, these have a receptacle that's naked. So if you remove all the flowers, there won't be anything left on there. It won't have little chaffy bracts or anything. And then the filaries are usually in 3 to 5 rows with their edges overlapping one another. So they kind of just like fold over the one next to them. And then their ray florets are always pistillate and kind of strap-like, meaning really thin. So this includes horseweed, which is a native plant, but it's incredibly weedy and it just grows like everywhere. And the heads are super, super tiny. That picture at the beginning where it had the little head next to a penny, that's the heads from this plant. And then this includes Erigeron, the fleabanes, which there's some weedy ones and some better ones from oak savannas and woodlands.
Are those other fleabanes all native?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Goldenrods, Solidago, so there's some woodland species, a lot of prairie species, the really weedy but native Canada goldenrod. And then the true asters, which are in the genus Symphiatricum now, not in the genus Aster. So that name is kind of confusing. But we've got a lot of really pretty native asters that bloom late in the fall. Prairie species, wetland species, and a number of woodland species as well. These are 2 of the most common ones that you'll see: frost aster with white ray florets, and then really long, broad branches to the sides. And then the New England aster, which will have either pink or purple ray florets, and both of them bloom till the end of October into November if we get a hard frost, and then they disappear.
So are they New England native there and not here, or are they native here too? The New England aster?
That's native here.
Yeah.
The only 2 species of Symphiatricum that we have that are not native to Wisconsin are introduced from the eastern seaboard and have just migrated in along salty roads. So the next 2 groups I'm going to talk about are actually related to one another. And they're in this order called the Poales, which includes a bunch of different families, including bromeliads and a bunch of tropical things. Most of the species are in these 2 really big families, the sedge family, Cyperaceae, and the grass family, the Poaceae, both of which are incredibly ecologically important around the world. And they all have this general trend in this order towards really tiny flowers that are wind pollinated. So first, a couple things that look like grasses and sedges but are not grasses and sedges include cattails. So they have their flowers in this very dense terminal inflorescence, and the flowers don't have sepals or petals. The individual flowers are separated on a cattail. So you've got female flowers down here that form like the cattail sausage part of it. And then the male flowers are held farther up on the stem, and these are fallen apart by the time the female flowers have developed into fruit. So the male flowers just have 3 stamens, and you can see they don't have any petals or sepals. And then the female flowers just have a single carpellate or unit to the ovary, and they just produce a single seed. So we have 2 species of cattails in Wisconsin, the broadleaved and the narrow-leaved. The narrow-leaved is introduced, and then they hybridize, and the hybrid outcompetes both of the parents and is really invasive. So the narrow-leaved one is a very big problem and its offspring. And then another family that looks a lot like grasses and sedges are the rushes. So the Juncaceae. They are just really small little herbs, but the main difference is in the flowers. So I'll show you sedge and grass flowers in a little bit that are very unusual. But in rushes, they have a very lily-looking flower. It's just really, really tiny, and it's brown. It's not showy like a daylily would be. So you can see that they've got 6 tepals, so 3 brown sepals, 3 brown petals, 6 stamens, and then a 3 carpellate ovary. So you can see there's 3 stigmas coming off of that. In Wisconsin, we have a number of species. Most of them are native. This is the Baltic rush that grows along Lake Michigan beaches and Lake Superior. Toad rush, which grows in a lot of different habitats, including pavement cracks. Canada rush. I don't know what the common name of this one is, but most of them grow in wetlands. There are a couple upland ones. This is a prairie species. And then this is the aptly named path rush, which grows along really heavily traveled trails and forests. It is native, but it's just really weedy. And then we have the sedge family, so the Cyperaceae. These plants look a lot like grasses, but they have, so in grasses and sedges, instead of calling them stems, we call them culms, C-U-L-M-S. They have usually triangular culms or stems. So if you cut a sedge in half and look at it like this, it will usually be triangular in cross section. And then their leaves are tristichous, which means they're arranged in 3s, but not all at the same area. What happens is one will come out like at 3 o'clock on a clock. The next one will be at 6, and then at 9, and then the next one will be at 3, and then 6, and then at 9. So they kind of like spiral up, but they all kind of follow that same pattern between the 3. And then the fruit is an achene, which is basically like a sunflower seed. So just a single seed with a hard shell around it. Not very economically important, but very important ecologically. And in Wisconsin, this is a really important family in our wetlands and in our forests. So this is a fen, I don't remember where I took this picture, but dominated by bulrushes. And there's lots of individual carex sedges in there as well. This is a sedge meadow up near Black River Falls. I mean, it's like 99% just sedges in that aptly named. There's just a couple showier flowering plants in there. Another wetland dominated by 3-way sedge, and then there's a couple other sedges in there too. Sedges can grow in a lot of different places. So this is the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, and they've got this pond with, the tar just seeping out of the ground there like it did. They've got these little models of elephants, I guess, dying in it. But there's sedges just like growing in the water there, totally unfazed by the tar in the water. So this is a genus that we've got in Wisconsin, but it obviously can handle some pretty awful pollution. And then also an important member of our woodland communities, so oak savannas, oak woodlands, sugar maple forests, conifer forests across the state, almost all of them, unless they're really, really heavily degraded, they will have sedges in them, and lots of times, many, many species. So in sedges, you've got usually those triangular stems, right? Usually three-sided. The pith, meaning like the inside of the stem, will be solid, whereas in grasses, it will usually be hollow. The leaves themselves sheath the stem, just like in a grass, which means that when the leaf comes down and hits the stem, it actually has tissue that like wraps around the stem a little bit and goes farther down. In sedges, that sheath will be fused around the stem. They will sometimes have a ligule, which I'll show a picture of that in a little bit. But what that is where the blade of a grass or a sedge meets the stem, there'll be like a little collar of tissue right there, and that's called a ligule. And then the flowers are held in unique inflorescences that are sometimes called spikes or sedge spikes that have a central axis, so right down the middle. And then around it are all these little spirally arranged little bracts, so a modified leaf. And then inside of that bract is the individual flower, where the sepals and petals are reduced to just like little tiny bristles. And then you've got 3 stamens and then a single ovary with either 2 or 3 stigmas. And then they produce a little akene fruit, which is shown right here. So just like a little plump sunflower seed. So here are 2 sedges. So I said in the first talk that there's a lot of rules for every family, and there's always things that break the rules, unfortunately. So here is a sedge that has a round stem. It doesn't have a triangular stem, but it does have the solid pith, right? So you can see these 2 sedges have solid pith, and then this grass has hollow pith. So here's a picture of the sheath. So you can see that there's like this fused tissue around the stem, and then there's like a little collar here, but that's not a true ligule. So some of the members of this family that we have are the bulrushes and the leafy bulrushes that are wetland species. So in the bulrushes, you see the inflorescence looks like it's just like exploding out of the leaf. But what's really happening is you have a single stem that comes up, terminates in an inflorescence, and then there's a leaf that grows around the entirety of the stem and then goes past the inflorescence, comes out like a little point. Rhynchospora, these are usually in fens or bogs up north, and this one has really white bracts, so it's pretty easy to see. It's actually somewhat showy for a sedge. 3-way sedge, so you can see the little individual spikes are down here. And then the cotton grasses, which are not a grass, it's not unfortunately named thing. These grow primarily up north in bogs, but they've got these really bright white bristles on the fruits that really stand out. Cyperus, the nut sedges. So we have some really weedy ones that grow in gardens and sidewalk cracks and on shores and anywhere that there's a lot of water that goes down later in the year, you'll see a lot of these come up. And then there are some dry prairie species as well. The spike rushes, so these are really difficult to ID. They're just like a single stem with no leaves except for what's the remnant of a little leaf at the bottom of the stem, and then just that little spike with all those little individual flowers. And you can really only tell them apart by their fruits. So they almost all look alike vegetatively, but once you get their fruits under a microscope, you can see that there's a lot of diversity there. They are all wetland plants, and all of them that we have in Wisconsin are native to the state. The largest genus in the family that we have, and the most complex and difficult, is Carex, the sedges. They have unisexual flowers. So in the other ones, you've got male and female parts within the same bract within the flower, so the bulrushes and things I showed. But in the sedges, Carex, they're separated. So you've got female flowers down here, and then male flowers up here. But they have the same basic construction. So you've got a little bract, like a little leaf, and then you've got either the stamens or the pistil just kind of nestled in there. And there's 3 different ways that these flowers are presented in Carex in Wisconsin. So you can have male and female flowers separate from one another on the same plant. So here's the male up here, and then there's the female. You can have gynecandrous ones where the female flowers are born on the same branch as the male, but the female are above the male. And then you can have androgynous, which is the same thing, but here the male ones are above the female ones rather than below. And being able to tell these three different ways that these are presented really helps with IDing them. So the female flowers in carex are a little bit different than in other sedges too. So you've got this little individual bract that sits below the female flower. But then the female flower itself, the ovary, is also enclosed in another bract called the periginium that completely wraps around it and takes on 1,000 different shapes across the whole world. So only carex has this structure. So those female flowers, little tiny bract here, and then another bract enveloping the female flower called the periginium. And this can be really tight on there, or it can be inflated, it can be pointy, it can be rounded, it can be fat, really long and skinny, just all over the place. Carex, like I said, is a huge genus, one of the 10 largest in the world. It's the largest genus in North America with over 480 species, over 160 just in Wisconsin. Here's a map of the contiguous United States. The darker green means the more species of carex that have been recorded from that county. So you can see that they're really diverse in the Great Lakes, Western Mountains, and then especially the Northeast. And then obviously not very much in the Great Plains. I'll go over just a couple of the most common ones that we have in Wisconsin. We could do a whole talk on all 160. Some of the earliest blooming ones are in this group. So they include Pennsylvania sedge, which is a really common woodland species, oak savanna, oak woodlands, very early blooming. And then Carex tonsa, which has really little Pyrogynia held down at the base of the plant. This grows in like really, really dry, sandy prairies. And then Carex umbellata, which grows in usually more calcareous, dry prairies, so like on bluff tops. And unfortunately, a lot of sedges don't have common names because there's just so many of them. There's nobody that wants to take the time to name them. Carex herdifolia, this is a really easy one to identify. It's got very fuzzy stems and leaves, and then the Pyrogynia are also hairy. This one grows in oak forests. I don't know if I've ever seen it around Oregon, but I have seen it just a little farther south in Evansville. Carex cephalophora has these really tight clusters of Pyrogynia with little bracts kind of coming out underneath, and it gives us this very like spiky look to it. This is a woodland or oak savanna species. The species in this particular section all have nodding inflorescences. So all the female Pyrogynia are on branches of the inflorescence that droop or nod. So Carex gracillima is pretty common. Carex springelii is also very common in woodlands. It blooms very, very early. Carex arctata. So this is a pretty easy one to recognize, at least this group. And then this is a really common one, Carex grisea, with these kind of spindle or elongated egg-shaped Pyrogynia. This one grows in less high-quality woodlands as well, so this one actually tends to hang on after disturbance. This group includes the white bear sedge, which is a really nice forest species, and then Carex blanda, which is a really common woodland one. I've seen it growing in lawns. It's very weedy. It has pretty distinct Pyrogynia, so the beak, the little tip of it, actually kind of bends down like the beak on a peep marshmallow. So they like bend, and they're a little bit inflated. In wetlands, you'll get a lot of these group of species from this section. So the tussock sedges, so if you ever walked in a wetland and found these like big clumps that trip you up as you walk, they're probably members of this section of sedges. So Carex stricta is a pretty common one. They've got really narrow, like pencil-looking inflorescences with really tightly packed, often flat Pyrogynia. In this group, the Pyrogynia have like a very distinct beak, and then the base of it is kind of inflated, so it gives it this bottle brush look. Most of these grow in wetlands. This picture was taken in a little tiny wetland that's next to headquarters. So a lot of them can grow in disturbed wetlands, marshes. This particular one, Caryx this is a wetland one with these really densely clustered Pyrogynia. And then it has this very distinctive, very triangular stem that's really squishy too. So it's very spongy. You can just like, bend it and it just falls over. Box sedge also has very densely aggregated Pyrogynia like that, and a much less spongy triangular stem, but it is a very common weedy wetland species. And then this particular group, the Ovalles, sedges, these are very, very annoying to key out. All of them are native, but they all look almost exactly the same. So they have these really tight clusters of overlapping Pyrogynia that often have very broad wings to them, and you can only tell them apart by measuring the wings. So this is a picture, a drawing from the Flora of North America, which covers the whole country and Canada. And those are all different species, but they all look the same, don't they? So they're just really annoying. But if you know you have one, all the ones in Wisconsin are native, so you can just leave it. Don't even worry about what it is. The last family I'll talk about is one of my favorites, the grass family. It's a huge, huge family across the world. It's on every single continent, including Antarctica. There's a single grass that grows in Antarctica on that little peninsula that comes out near the tip of South America. Really highly modified inflorescence and flowers, which I'll get into in a little bit. Ecologically dominant in open grasslands, obviously, giving the name. So prairies, steppes across Europe and Eurasia, savannas in Africa, South America. Super, super important for wildlife across the entire world. So in Wisconsin, mainly a family of uplands, especially open ones. So oak savannas and prairies, barrens, oak barrens, pine barrens. It is the most economically important group of plants on the planet. So many of our, staple crops across the world are members of this family. So corn in the New World, wheat in Europe, rice in Asia, all different kinds of grains that were domesticated in Africa as well. And then not just for ourselves, but also for livestock and then game. And you could argue that, civilization was possible because of domesticating grasses. So once ancient people figured out that they could domesticate and grow these plants for the huge amount of calories that they can produce, then we could create cities that stayed in one place and didn't need to be hunter-gatherers. So corn, wheat, rice, millet, oats, sugarcane is a grass. Lemongrass for flavoring, lots of alcohols from this family as well. And then turf and lots of weeds. So you can see here just the worldwide tons of these different crops that grasses just blow the other ones out of the water. And unfortunately, sugar is the biggest one. But corn, rice, wheat, three top ones, three most important grains. So this is an old picture from one of my professors that showed a meal, right? And then a meal as if grasses had never existed. So it's just potatoes and rice, or potatoes and lettuce, sorry. So corn is obviously gone, the meat was gone, the butter, the milk, the bread. I never could figure out what this orange thing is. I think it's supposed to be jelly or something. But all those different things that depend on grasses, right? It's all the meats that we eat. And obviously grasses can support a huge amount of biomass, right? So the Serengeti plains, there's thousands and thousands of animals out there, and they're almost all eating grass, or they're eating something that is eating grass. So it's obviously a very important family. So in the grasses, the flowers are much more complicated. In Wisconsin, they're all annuals or perennials, but there's obviously other parts of the world where they're kind of woody, so bamboos. They have stems that are hollow, right? So you saw that cross-section earlier. Their leaves are simple, and then they're distichous, which means that they come out one across from the other, and then they switch. So it's always like a fan look to it. So two here, then two here, and two here, up and alternating back and forth on the stem like that. They have sheathing leaves as well that wrap around the stem, but usually the sheath is open. So if you find a flowering grass later in the year and follow that leaf down, you'll see that the little margins of it are just overlapping. They're not actually fused together. And then they will have a true ligule. So where that sheath part meets the blade, there'll be this little fringe of hairs or a fringe of kind of papery tissue that kind of blocks where the leaf meets the stem. Then they have their inflorescence. So the structure that bears the flowers is called the spikelet. And then these are held in a bigger inflorescence that has multiple branches or maybe just back and forth on that branch or on that axis. So this spikelet is arranged with a bunch of different specialized bracts. So a single grass spikelet has two bracts at the bottom called glumes, and there's nothing inside of them. There's a lower glume or first glume, some books call it, and then an upper glume or the secondary glume. Then alternating back and forth on the rest of that rachilla, it's called that individual axis, are one or many individual florets, so tiny flowers. These little flowers are made up of two bracts, and then the sexual parts are inside. The bottom bract is called a lemma, and the upper bract is called a palea. And so the lemma comes out and it's at the bottom, and the palea kind of sits inside of it, and they close over the reproductive parts of the flower. Most grasses will have both sexes in the same flower, although there are some where just female or just male will be in there, but the majority of them will have both sexes in there. And so there will be a couple little stamens and then a single pistil with two stigmas that produces the grain, so the rice or the corn seed or whatever. And then at the base of the ovary are little things called loticules, which swell with water and push open the lemma and the palea so that the stamens can come out and release wind or release pollen onto the wind, and then the loticules shrink, and then the spike or the floret closes back up and protects the flower later on when the fruit forms. The lemmas can have what's called an awn, so this little like tooth or spike coming off the tip. And some grasses have it, some don't, but it's often diagnostic for telling which grass you have. And then the fruit is called a caryopsis, which is the technical term for a grain. And in there, the seed is fused to the seed coat. So here are some pictures of grass stems. This is that ligule I was talking about. So this little membranous piece of tissue that comes out right where the blade and the sheath meet one another. And then this is that distichous leaf arrangement. So it just goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth on the stem. Here's an open sheath. So you can see that these parts just kind of overlap one another. An auricle can be sometimes present in the grasses, and it's just like a little ear-shaped piece of tissue at the base of the blade. I won't go through this whole thing, but it did include in the PDF that Teresa sent out. It just shows the main differences between rushes, sedges, and grasses for telling the three apart with their leaves, and then the most important are the flowers for telling them apart. But you can see that rushes don't ever have a ligule. Sedges sometimes do. Grasses will always have them. The fruits are different between the three. So you've got the grain in grasses, the keen in the sedges, and then a capsule in the rushes, which if you've ever let your daylilies go to fruit, that little brown thing that has like three openings, that's a capsule. And rush fruits look just like that, but they're really tiny.
The word graminoids, does that, the first part of that word gram, does that have anything to do with prairie grasses that are called grama grass?
No, the old name for the family is Gramineae, which just means grasses. Yeah. And so graminoid means like a grass.
Graminoid means like a grass. Okay.
So here are just some drawings to kind of show those differences between grasses, sedges, and rushes. And then getting into some of our grasses that we've got in the state. So in this group, the wild rices and then the rice cut grass, there's always, like I said, exceptions to the rules. So these don't have glooms. They've just got like a single floret with were interpreted to be vestigial lemmas, and then they've got 6 stamens instead of 3. But this includes wild rice, right, which has unisexual flowers. So the female ones are down there, and then the male ones are farther up on the plant. And then rice cutgrass, which is a pretty common wetland plant with really sharp, little tiny hairs on the leaves. Like you walk through it and you'll know it will immediately cut your legs. The reed, Phragmites. We have both native and non-native strains of this in the state. Unfortunately, the non-native one introduced from Eurasia is much more common and it's much bigger. These are huge grasses, probably our tallest grass that we've got in the state, with a really big inflorescence, tons and tons of spikelets, with lots of hairs, giving it this very fluffy look. And then they can be really, really big, right? So there's a person, this is a colleague of mine's wife. I think she's like 5, 6 or so, and they're big, big plants, and unfortunately very invasive. 3-on grasses. So these have a single floret in the spikelet, and then the lemma has that long on, but then it splits into 3 parts of it, and then they curl. So you can see here, and they actually they curl and uncurl based on the humidity in the air. And when they land in the ground, they actually like drill themselves into the ground and plant themselves. So we've got a couple of species in the state, all from very sandy, dry prairies, like you can see in the background here. This is another exception to the rule. So these grasses in this group have sheaths that are closed, not open. And then their spikelets have mini florets. So this includes Glyceria armana grasses. So they look like kind of like a little rattlesnake tail. And then false mellet grass, which is a really pretty woodland species. There's a lot of this growing in the Baraboo Hills if you go up to Devil's Lake and Parfrey's Glen, that area. In this group, they're bunch grasses. So these are grasses that just have a ton of stems coming out from a little clump like that, rather than just like a single stem out of the ground. This includes the rough-leaved rice grass, which is a woodland species that blooms very, very early. And then the needle grass, which also has a really, really long on that spirals, dry prairie species. The bromes, these have fused sheaths as well. And then they all have a panicle inflorescence, which means that there's a central axis, it branches, and then each of those side branches branches again and then terminates in the individual spikelets. Smooth brome is probably the most common one. It's a highly invasive introduced species, but we do have some native bromes. And then on the leaf of a smooth brome, there's a little W indentation that you can see here. Cheatgrass is in this genus, so it's a really bad invasive out west. It's in Wisconsin, but it's usually just along roadsides. And then there are some nice prairie species like this one. This is a wet prairie or fen species, French brome. In this group, which includes rye, barley, wheat, these have auricles on the leaves, so those little like ear-like flaps of tissues. And then a spike inflorescence with 1 to 4 spikelets at each node, alternating sides. So here you can see there's 1 spikelet, then another, and then another, and so on and so forth. In this species, at each node, there's like 2 or 3 or 4 spikelets that come out together, and then at the next node, there's 4 spikelets, so on and so forth. So this includes foxtail barley, which is a really pretty species that's introduced from out west. But you'll see it in the highway medians later in the year, and it just looks really pretty as it like moves like a wave. And then rye and wheat, flatgrass introduced. Canada wild rye is native. I think there's a lot of this grown in the Lerner Conservation Park. Bottlebrush grass is native. We have a regional endemic. So this species of Elymus just grows on the shore of Lake Michigan in Wisconsin and Michigan, maybe historically in Illinois. It's very bluish in color. You can see it. It's very hard to photograph grasses, obviously, but you can see that it's there. This group includes a lot of the most common grasses that you'll probably see. So the fescues, the bluegrasses, ryegrass. So the true fescues, festuca. So we have a couple native species. One is in woodlands, and then a lot of weedy ones. Ryegrass, which is used as a turf grass sometimes, but it does escape. And then this alkali grass, which is an introduced species that tolerates obviously very salty conditions and grows along highway medians. And then includes orchard grass, which has this kind of distinct inflorescence where you've got a bunch of branches kind of clustered together at the top, and then a much lower branch that's almost like a little mitten thumb or like a little hand waving farther down. Oops. And then Timothy, really common forage grass. Both of these are introduced from Europe for forage and then have escaped, but neither of them is very invasive. Red top, agrostis. This is introduced. It has this very distinct branching pattern where you've got, you know, a distinct node with a bunch of branches coming out, and then there's a big space, and then there's another one, another one, another one, and it's reddish in color, hence the common name. Related to it are native tickle grasses, they're called. These have very airy inflorescences, very light looking on the wind. And then the bluegrasses. So Canada bluegrass, which has a dumb common name because it's from Europe. Very highly aggressive grass. You find it in all different kinds of places, and you can climb up to like the top of a cliff face where there's, you know, remnant pines and stuff, and it's really nice. And then that stupid grass is up there somehow. Like, I don't know how it gets everywhere. Annual bluegrass. This is a European species. This is the most widely distributed weed in the world. It's been found pretty much everywhere. It's not really invasive, but it clearly does well with humans. This is probably growing in your lawn or your sidewalk cracks. It blooms really early. I think we might have records of it blooming in like February. And like I was talking about earlier, in the true bluegrasses of the genus Poa, the tip of the leaf is fused just ever so slightly at the tip to form like a keel of a boat. And that's how you can tell that genus from a lot of our other ones. Most of the species of bluegrass that you'll encounter in the state are introduced. A lot of the native ones are not very common. This also includes Canada blue joint, Calamagrostis, oats, reed canary grass, unfortunately, highly invasive species. Ammophila, the beach grass, which grows along the shore of Lake Michigan and Lake Superior and really binds the sand dunes there. So you can see this is an eroded dune, but you can see all of these, what are called rhizomes, these underground stems that just creep out through the sand and bind it and keep it from getting washed away by the waves.
The reed canary grass that's introduced? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that also does the same thing. It just binds the soil and keeps out any competition. Then we have the love grasses, so purple love grass, Aragrostis, stink grass. This is an introduced species that whose inflorescence, when you crush it, does smell kind of gross. Prairie drop seeds, so Spirobolus. These all just have a single floret in the spikelet. So this is the most commonly cultivated one. This is one that's native but kind of weedy, grows on shores and along railroad tracks and things. The muleys or Muhlenbergia. So we've got a number of species in here. These are two of the most common ones. So Mexican muley, I guess Muhlenbergia mexicana, with this kind of densely packed inflorescence. In this group, all the spikelets have just a single flower in them. This is a really common species in pretty much any kind of open habitat, wet or dry. And then this little one, Nimblewill, this is a really common forest trail grass, or even in lawns as well. It's got these really spindly inflorescences, a super tiny spikelet, kind of a cute little native grass. The side oats grama, hairy grama are also closely related to Muhlenbergia, with these little densely packed spikelets on just one side of that inflorescence. Looks like a little eyebrow or a caterpillar. Oh, so I should have said, in all the other grasses I just showed, that spikelet is laterally compressed, so like it's flattened in such a way that the individual spikelets kind of like look like this. Here's a good picture of it here. So you can see that these are kind of flattened in such a way that you can, other than laterally compressed. In another group of grasses that we have a bunch of different species, they're dorsoventrally compressed, which means that they're compressed in the other way, so they end up looking fat rather than flat. And these are called the panicoid grasses, and their spikelets are a little bit different. So they have a lower glume and then an upper glume. So this is showing one side of it. Here's the lower glume, and then it's flipping it over, and there's the bottom of that lower glume, and then this is the upper glume. Then within there, there's a single floret, but there's a regular lemma and palea in there, but then there's also a sterile lemma. So there's a lemma that's not associated with any reproductive parts, and it doesn't have palea. So it's a little bit different construction, but you can tell them apart from the other grasses because they've got that spikelet compressed in a different way, and they look different. They're chubbier looking than the other spikelets. And then these are all grasses that flower later in the year and mostly have what's called C4 photosynthesis, where they've adapted to grow in hotter and drier conditions, so they flower later in the year. So this includes a lot of weeds that are introduced, so crabgrass, barnyard grass, the fall panic grasses and the switch grasses, which are related to one another. So dicanthelium, these are mostly prairie species, savannas, a couple of woodland ones that flower pretty early in the year, and then they flower again in the fall. And then switchgrass, which is a really common prairie species. Lots of different cultivars developed for this for landscaping. Foxtails, really common weeds, where there's all these little individual spikelets in there, but all of these bristles are actually branches of that inflorescence that have been modified into little bristles rather than branches holding flowers. And so all the flowers are just condensed on that inflorescence. All of the species of Soteria are introduced. Sandbur, this is a really painful native grass. And this, you have what are actually all these little spines on this like involucre, it's called. Those are actually branches of that inflorescence that have been modified into a burr that completely surrounds the spikelet itself. And then they're just open enough that the reproductive parts can come out, get pollinated, and then form the fruit, and then it gets dispersed by getting stuck in your feet or your shoes or on fur of something. It's really common in sandy areas like along the Wisconsin River. And this group, which is has the same type of spikelets, they have slightly different spikelets as well. There's always little things that make them confusing. They have spikelets in pairs. So they've got like a typical panicoid looking spikelet paired with a narrower one like this on a little tiny peg. So there's one that's sessile without a stem, and then one that does have a little tiny stem right there. These include sorghum, which is used for syrups and stuff. Miscanthus, Chinese feathergrass, which is really invasive. Corn, Indian grass.
Is feathergrass the same as pampas grass?
No, technically not. So the pampas grasses, I can't remember what genus that actually is, but they're not technically hardy here.
Oh,
So
okay.
like when they're sold, they're just putting the name on something that shouldn't have it.
Oh, so the name pampas grass really isn't pampas grass. You're saying it's most probably feathergrass.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So like the true pampas grasses can't grow in our climate.
Okay.
And so I think there's just a lot of confusion with like calling the feathergrass pampas grass, or people just mislabel it at nurseries and stuff like that, because you won't be able to grow the pampas grass here.
Oh, good to know. Okay, great.
So Indian grass, common prairie grass, and then our other two really common prairie grasses and landscape grasses, big blue stem and little blue stem, are also in this group. Good. Any questions about any of those three families?
Bottlebrush grass, we have some of that we planted, and it seems to be it's oak woodland sort of located, and it seems spreading very easily. Is that typical or not? And
When I see it, it's usually common in the woodlands. Like it's not really aggressive necessarily. I mean, I think a lot of times, depending on where the plants come from, you might get a genotype, so like a genetic makeup of that particular species that is just slightly more aggressive or something than the one that is truly native to our area, right? So, that could be part of the issue, if you want to call it that, is that you've just brought in a genotype that's just a little bit better at competing than the native one. And it could also be that you've created conditions that are good for bottlebrush grass, right? So like when we think about ecological restoration, we're trying to take this little chunk of time and put this habitat into like this perfect thing that we think it is, right? But it's gone through thousands and thousands of years of changes, right? And so when people, restore a prairie, and they're like, oh, it got taken over by Canada bluegrass. Well, maybe the natural process was that, or not Canada bluegrass, sorry, Canada goldenrod took over for 50 years and then died. And then, everything else came back in where, we don't have the luxury of that amount of time to see that pretty prairie come to fruition. So we want that stuff gone right away, and we want those other things coming in. So I guess that's a roundabout way of saying I don't really have an answer to that, but there's lots of different things that are going on that could cause that, but I don't think it's anything to be like concerned about. It's not really like an aggressive grass.
So the real question is, so it produces fairly profuse amounts of seed, and like, okay, what do we do with that? And we got this north-facing part of a ridge is the remnant of woodland that we have, and then the top that we also owned the part of the top of the ridge, which had been, I don't know if it was cleared or whatever, but it's like a field. It's open. There's some woody stuff coming up, and planted fruit trees there, but it was grazed. Horses were grazed on it, that sort of thing. So I'm wondering about this bottlebrush grass seed. Could we spread it up in where the field area is? I mean, would that be reasonable? Would it?
Yeah, you probably could. When I worked for the Forest Service in Ohio, one of the jobs I had was to harvest bottlebrush grass seed, because then when they came back in after a logging operation, that was one of the first things that they would try to seed in to get to come up so they didn't get as much garbage coming in there. So I could see doing that, because it's a forest species, but it's also a savanna species, so it can handle a little bit of sun, but not like super all day direct.
Okay. So we'll spread it around, see what happens.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Is the Wisconsin Herbarium the best place to look to find out if something is really native? Yeah.
So we have a website called Flora, WIS, and Flora, FLORA. And that lists every species of wild plant that's been recorded from the state, and you can look at all the individual specimens where they've been recorded from, see maps of where they grow in the state, and then we have listed if that species is native or not. So a lot of the things that like are treated as like Midwest natives, which they truly are, but aren't technically native to Wisconsin, so like Echinacea purpurea, the purple coneflower, that's based on the fact that we don't have records of that plant going back very far, right? So like the first plants that were collected by like increased Lapham or whatever, we know that a lot of those must have been native. They must have been here pre-European settlement. But then for some of those things like the purple coneflower or beard tongue, Penstemon digitalis, like the first record of escaped populations of that or wild populations would be from like the 60s or 50s. So we know that that probably came in after Europeans, right? It probably was not part of our flora and then like disappeared and came back. It probably came in because of people, just like pokeweed, the giant ugly thing. It may be native, but most of the records have come in after the 1960s. So it's probably just spread because we've created good habitat for it, and it probably wasn't here beforehand.
That website you said is Flora.
If you just, I don't know what the exact URL is, but if you just Google Flora, it will be the first result.
They used to teach us in the forestry classes that rushes are round and sedges have edges.
Yeah.
But clearly the bulrush, for example, is a sedge.
Yeah. So most of the, like, that does hold true most of the time, right? Like, and even like all the families that I covered in the other talk, like, here's how you can tell this family most of the time, right? So like every member of the carrot family looks kind of like a carrot, except rattlesnake master, which doesn't look anything like that.
Oh,
So, yeah. And students usually hated that.
So warm season and cool season grasses, I suppose that should be explanatory, but is there any relationship to, do native grasses tend to be more cool season than warm season or vice versa?
I don't know the exact numbers. We probably have more cool season grasses, at least native ones, than we do warm season ones. So like our warm season ones would be like purple lovegrass, the blue stems, Indian grass, switchgrass, the Muhlenbergias that I showed, and then a bunch of the weed ones. And then I would say most of the native ones are probably cool season. So like blue joint, bluegrass, tickle grasses. It's really early. That's actually native. Those are the bigger ones. Fescues. Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers. That's a good question, but I think most of ours are probably cool season ones.
How's this is going back a little bit further, but glaciation has come and gone over the years. It had to change everything.
Yeah.
And so is there fossil record or like pollen records?
Yeah, there's pollen records.
Yeah,
For a lot of stuff, but only things that would produce a lot of pollen at a time. So like wind pollinated things. So we've got good records of conifers and trees and then weedy things too. So and looking at the pollen records, there's a lot of right after the glaciers, what we call like no analog plant communities, where the pollen that was deposited in the lakes doesn't make sense. So like right after the glaciers receded, there's like a ton of spruce pollen and then a ton of ragweed pollen.
Huh.
And nowadays they never grow together, right? Yeah. But so like, what did that look like? It must have been this retreating wet area that supported spruce, then was totally open for ragweed to come into. Like it doesn't really make sense, but you don't get a lot of pollen of showy stuff because it's not blowing on the wind. It's getting stuck in the flowers and not really falling. So, yeah. So we know that ragweed was here for 10,000 years. Yeah.
I'm calling that native.
All right. Thank you very much.